There's been a lot of chat recently about an article written by Greens MP Max Chandler-Mather, thanks in large part to the PM's creative misrepresentation of it in a much-shared clip from Question Time.
He went on to say this: we're opposing 30,000 social and affordable homes because...
He never said that.
The article itself is an explanation of why the Greens are standing firm against the government's pressure to wave through the Housing Australia Future Fund bill. If you're able to read it with an open mind, it may give you some insight on why Labor are attacking the man and not the issue in this instance. When I've seen criticism of this article, I get a very real sense that people either didn't read the whole thing or they didn't understand the points it was making. So as part of my community service, let's walk through the article together to see what it's all about, and why Elbow's little Question Time performance was off the mark and irrelevant in terms of genuine debate. As I said, the point of the article is to explain why the Greens have, so far, refused to wave through the HAFF bill. To do that, the article provides the context of what the government's proposed Housing Australia Future Fund bill is, and highlights the actual scale of the housing crisis. I'll read through sections of the article and then provide commentary afterwards. This article was first published on the 6th of February 2023. Labor's plan is to gamble $10 billion on the stock market via the government's Future Fund, which lost money last year, and to spend a limited fraction of the returns on housing. Now, gamble might be an emotive word, but this is all true. The plan is to borrow $10 billion and to give it to the Peter Costello-chaired Future Fund to invest on the stock market. And yes, investing on the stock market can be a bit of a gamble. There's never a guarantee on the return you might receive. And yes, the Future Fund did lose money last year. In the 2022 calendar year, the Future Fund reported a 3.7% loss, which was a loss of approximately $7.5 billion. On top of that, the Future Fund had to pay its costs as well. For the sake of transparency, the government could explain to Australians how much money each year will be eaten up by costs, both direct and look-through. I mean, they won't, because when you're only dispersing $500 million out of the fund, it's probably not a good look to let people know you're spending in order of $140 to $160 million each year in costs associated with just managing that fund. Under Labor's proposal, even when the fund does make a return, funding for housing would be capped at $500 million a year. Okay, this statement was true at the time the article was written. Since then, Labor have closed the loophole, thanks to pressure from the Greens and the crossbench, so that $500 million is the floor and not the ceiling of what can be spent. That's an improvement that wouldn't exist had the bill just been waved through in its initial form. By way of comparison, Labor will spend $30 billion per year on the Stage 3 tax cuts that give a tax break of $9,000 to everyone earning over $200,000. While I've seen a few figures thrown around as to how much the Stage 3 tax cuts will cost, the most recent Parliamentary Budget Office costings suggest that the Stage 3 tax cuts will cost the government $313 billion over a decade. So you divide that figure by 10 and you'll arrive at just over $30 billion per year. So yeah, what he's got there sounds about right.
As an interesting side note,
worse still, when you look at the detail around the Stage 3 tax cuts, you'll find that while the government intends to spend over $30 billion per year in total, around half of that figure will be spent on people earning over $180,000 per year. So that's over $15 billion spent per year on those people earning $180,000 or more. Remember that the HAFF is planning on allocating $500 million per year. That's just...
wow.
Worse, because the proposed fund will only be allowed to spend money after it has generated an adequate return, at a minimum it will be 2025 before a single home is completed. Yeah, that's true. If it goes ahead, the first HAFF disbursement will occur in the 2024-25 financial year. The Housing Minister herself has confirmed this a few times.
We have agreed that $500 million will come out from 2024, guaranteed disbursement, guaranteeing a $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year.
In other words, it won't be until mid-2024 before the first $500 million of the Housing Australia Future Fund will be allocated. Furthermore, the Housing Minister has also said that work won't start until the funds are flowing.
In relation to this particular fund, assuming that you do get it through, when would the first home be built?
Well, it'll take a little while for those returns to come through, so the sooner we can get the fund through, the sooner we can get homes on the ground. These types of plans and projects take quite a while to get off the ground, and so as soon as the money's able to flow, we have houses going under construction straight away.
And just briefly, how long do you think that will take?
Well, it will take a few months to get the returns from the fund. We anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return.
Notice how she wasn't prepared to even provide a year? Based on an average build time of 6 to 12 months per home, it's fair to say that 2025 is the earliest a home will be completed under the HAFF. Labor claims the HAFF will finance the construction of 30,000 social and affordable homes over 5 years. So far, they have not defined affordable, and at any rate, it's extremely unlikely their plan will achieve anything near that target. It's true they haven't defined affordable in the bill, a point which was made by many of the submissions collected as part of the bill's consultation period, and based on basic maths, it's fair to say the bill as presented is unlikely to deliver 30,000 homes in 5 years. If the HAFF were to issue $500 million each year in disbursements, that's $2.5 billion over 5 years. It sounds like a lot, but using an average cost per social housing dwelling of $300,000, that works out to 1,666 homes per year, or 8,333 homes will be built over 5 years. Even if it does, that is, achieve the target, the current national shortage of social and affordable housing is 640,000, and this number is due to increase by another 75,000 homes in the next 5 years. So yep, the Community Housing Industry Association puts the current shortfall at 640,000 homes. On top of that, demand is increasing year on year. So even if the HAFF could build 30,000 homes over 5 years, the gap between what is available compared to what is needed is only going to increase. Other figures from the University of New South Wales suggest that 950,000 social and affordable homes will be needed by 2041 to meet demand. So around 50,000 new dwellings would be required per year. While you might find varying projections and estimates, they all have one thing in common, and that is that they are all far higher than what the HAFF will deliver. The ALP is withdrawing funding for 24,000 rentals subsidised under the National Rental Affordability Scheme. Yeah, that's correct, that scheme is being wound up. In sum, even if the Greens do pass Labor's plan, the proportion of social housing in Australia will actually decline to a historical low of 3.4% of total housing stock. Now, to be fair, I couldn't find an exact source for this one. However, given where Australia is currently in terms of the shortfall, and given the relatively tiny amount of housing the HAFF will add, I'd suggest this is probably in the ballpark. In comparison, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development averages 15%. In comparable countries like Austria, over 20% of housing is community or public. Yeah, we're not world leaders here, not at all. If it wasn't clear already, Labor's plan won't even touch the sides of the housing crisis, let alone provide relief for renters. In effect, it doesn't even maintain the status quo. I think it's fairly safe to say that's true. The bill doesn't maintain the status quo. At best, it will see us go backwards in real terms as demand rises at a far higher rate than the HAFF can respond to. There's already a shortfall into the hundreds of thousands, and demand on top of that is increasing at a rate of 15 to 50,000 homes per year, depending on what figures you want to use. So adding 6,000 homes a year, best case, or 1,666 if you're going to be a little bit more realistic, only means you're going to fall further behind. This next section is largely opinion or ideological debate or philosophical musings, take your pick. You're either going to agree with it or you won't, depending on which team you want to barrack for. This is probably the point in the article where most people's eyes glaze over. I mean, you can mount a strong argument that the whole HAFF concept is neoliberal policy. The Future Fund itself was a creation of the Liberal government and then Treasurer Peter Costello, who coincidentally is currently the chair of the Future Fund.
I'm pleased to announce the appointment of Peter Costello as the new chair of the Future Fund board. And of course it was Peter Costello who set up the Future Fund.
The Liberal Party rewards success.
What a world. Ensuring the HAFF is off-budget is also a very liberal way of hiding what's going on. How so? Off-budget is literal. It won't appear on the budget, therefore hiding the government's true spending and allowing a government to post surpluses and brag about them on social media. I'm going to get sidetracked, but really, is now a good time for a government to be bragging about a surplus? You know that surplus means that there's more money in the kitty than what's being spent, right? Public housing has been chronically underfunded. I think most people would agree with that. Hardcore Labor supporters will say it's all because of 9 years of coalition neglect, unironically ignoring the simple fact that even if that were true, The HAFF is not going to shift that dial because, as you've seen, $500 million a year is a drop in the ocean compared to what's really needed. So the ALP will just be continuing on with that chronic underinvestment, if anything. It's also pretty well accepted these days that negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions are throwing a huge amount of fuel on the housing crisis fire. Any mention of either of these things, though, just drags out comments and references to how Labor lost the 2019 election, which in my view anyway is a little short-sighted given a lot has changed in the last 4 years, not least of which is the voting demographics and the proportion of voters that are renting. Coincidentally, the current housing minister used to carry some strong opinions about what should be done about negative gearing and capital gains tax. This section of the article ends with what I think is one of the key points he's trying to make. Federal Labor and its state counterparts are trying to convince the public that it's not possible for the government to do more to respond to the housing crisis. And this is the key to understanding the HAFF. It isn't designed to tackle the housing crisis. It's designed to make it look like Labor has done something. And once the government has done something, they hope it will reduce the social and political pressure on the federal government to actually do something. Now that's going to sound confronting to some people, but it does provide some important context to the carefully selected quotes that the PM used to try and embarrass the Greens in question time. Let's break it down slowly. The HAFF, as it stands, is a bad bill. It's grossly inadequate compared to what's actually required. When people say something is better than nothing, I'm not sure they quite understand that what this will deliver in its current form is so close to nothing that most people won't notice it exists. But like a plot taken straight from an episode of Hollow Man or Utopia, the HAFF is not designed to tackle the housing crisis. It's designed to sound big and grand to the general public. It's always referred to in the terms of the $10 billion. It sounds impressive until you apply just a little bit of critical thinking, but the government are banking on people not having the time for that. The HAFF is designed to make it look like the government are taking action to show that they are doing something, and in delivering this, the government has something that they can point to whenever they're criticised. They can say, look at the centrepiece of our housing plan, $10 billion. It gives them something that they hope will relieve pressure on them so that they can avoid actually having to take proper action. To be fair, I think the government do actually know what needs to be done. I just don't think they're prepared to do it at the moment because they don't find it politically appetising right now. Once Parliament passes a plan, it constrains civil society's ability to demand more, even if the plan is worse than a band-aid. Basically, he's saying that once you accept rubbish, it's very hard to get anything better. Now here's the paragraph that includes one of the selective quotes Albanese used in Parliament. I'll include Albo's reading at the appropriate time. Consequently, if the Greens were to wave through the HAFF bill, it would foreclose on the possibility of building the social and political pressure needed to force the government to take meaningful action. Partly this is because Green support would give tacit endorsement not only to the HAFF but to Labor's broader argument that this is the best the government can do in the current circumstances. And this is just not true. The consequences would be abandoning millions of people to permanent housing stress as they struggle to pay rent, wait for social housing, or are forced to sleep in their cars or on the streets.
Allowing the HAFF to pass would demobilise the growing section of civil society that is justifiably angry about the degree of poverty and financial stress that exists in such a wealthy country.
Now you may need to read that whole thing a couple of times to really absorb it, but essentially what is being said here is that if the Greens had waved through the initial bill, they would be giving the bill their endorsement, which would in turn limit their ability to negotiate to improve it. If they'd just waved through a garbage bill that wouldn't shift the dial on the overall problem, or even keep pace with the level of demand, more people will suffer in the longer term because it reduces pressure on the government to take actual action. By refusing to pass Labor's housing plan without even a debate, the Greens forced a national discussion about large-scale investment in public housing and a rent freeze. This can help lay the political foundations needed to push Labor into making real, lasting concessions. In parliamentary terms, threatening to vote against the HAFF is the only immediate leverage the Greens have to force Labor to take serious action. And just as important,
this parliamentary conflict helps create the space for a broader campaign in civil society.
By disrupting Labor's attempts to sandbag the rapidly deteriorating status quo, we're also disrupting their attempt to convince the public that nothing can really change. The door-knocking stuff, well, yeah, door-knocking in Labor electorates was always going to piss off Labor, really, wasn't it? You can take the door-knocking and their research with a grain of salt if you like. Personally, I'd prefer to see some independent research. Labor has largely tried to avoid engaging with Greens' policy proposals or demands. Instead, they've operated on the implicit assumption that the government will never have to concede anything substantial. Consequently, much of the discussion has focused on whether or not the Greens will roll over and support Labor's housing plan, largely unamended. A compliant media without the time or inclination to interrogate Labor's plan has helped with this framing. I think that's probably fair because initially there did seem to be an assumption that the bill would be waved on through. A lot of people seem to be making that mistake still. That is, they're thinking that if the government present a bill, there's an obligation for everyone else to pass it. Nope, there's no such obligation. Labor has tried to discredit the Greens, attempting to paint the party as hypocritical for opposing particular private developments. Yep, they have. This was put to Max Chandler-Mather on Insiders, for example, and yep, the devil was in the detail.
You've been accused in your own seat of not supporting more housing supply. There's a big housing development on the Brisbane riverbank that has more than 850 new dwellings that you opposed. Another development on an old industrial site with 2 residential towers that you opposed. I mean, what do you say to this? Is it a case that more housing supply needs to go in someone else's backyard?
No, so the development you're referring to was proposed to be built in a giant floodplain. And our point was that...
Well, the council assessment found there was no additional flood risk, to be clear.
Well, no, they relied on developer paid for flood modelling, but if you...
Well, they followed the assessment process that council always follows.
Yeah, and in the past, and I know what that leads to, because during the floods, I was in people's basements where a developer had been approved to build a development tower, and they had lost power and lost everything they owned.
Okay, what about the other side, the one that's not on a floodplain? You opposed that as well.
Going to have to stop you right there, David. Let's take a look. The first development referred to here is the Bulimba Barracks. As Max points out, it's on a floodplain, as in basically the whole site is on a floodplain. Given the developers' other projects are often described using terms such as luxurious and 5-star luxury, it's hard to see whatever's being proposed here ticking off any social and affordable housing boxes. It's bound to make the developers a mint though, I'm sure. And the second one, the West End Towers, yep, that's also in a flood zone. Here's a fun fact, in Brisbane it's still not prohibited to build on floodplains, which is kind of odd given that the Brisbane River floodplain has been described as the most flood-impacted area in Australia.
The argument is that somehow NIMBYs or a hold-up in the planning system is what's causing the housing crisis. There is no evidence of that. So over the last 8 years, 94...
Really? No evidence?
No. So 94% of planning approvals, so planning applications in Sydney and Melbourne were approved, and 100,000 of those approved dwellings in Sydney were not built because developers will only ever build properties where they make a profit. Our point to the government is when you have land in the city, it should be held over for public and affordable housing, because what you get instead is either a developer building high-end apartments no one can afford, or land banking it and only building it when house prices are increasing.
The article then goes on to suggest that, from the perspective of Labor and property developers, the problem is that developers don't have enough power to build as many homes as they want. They would have us believe that the housing crisis has been caused by NIMBYs and overly tight planning restrictions. I mean, yeah, I've seen this narrative do the rounds, and it's partly why Max Chandler-Mather has had to respond to the NIMBY questions like the ones from Spears on Insiders. The facts belie this pro-developer narrative. From 1996 to 2018, supply of private dwellings exceeded demand by 500,000 homes. Indeed, from 2015 onward, there were more dwellings being constructed in comparison to the population than at any other time in the last 60 years. Yet despite this increase in supply, housing prices have surged in recent years, as have rents. On the night of the 2021 census, there were 1 million vacant dwellings, but this didn't lower prices. This is because developers will only supply housing if it doesn't drive down property prices. This often means they will hold up construction if they think extra supply could lower prices. In Sydney, for example, authorities approved 94% of development applications over the last 9 years. However, 100,000 dwellings with approval were never built. Yep, you can find all that information in this paper here. Construction has been on quite the upward trajectory there. And yep, on the night of the 2021 census there were 1 million vacant dwellings, with some areas having higher vacancy rates than others. And yep, we're fresh off the strongest annual growth in property prices on record. This is because developers will only supply housing if it doesn't drive down property prices. Yep, in case it wasn't obvious, developers are usually in the property business to turn a profit. Sitting on property or land, aka land banking, to sell at a higher price when demand exceeds supply is a big part of the gig. It's not in their financial interest to flood the market and drive down prices. Elephant in the room. Big developers carry big influence. You didn't think they'd fork out millions of dollars in donations to political parties for nothing, did you? Toward the start of the article, there's one sentence that really sums up the whole thing. In its current form, Labor's plan will see the housing crisis worsen, while doing nothing to support renters. I mean, that is objectively true. Crunch the numbers and tell me how the HAFF will cause a noticeable shift of the dial. On this issue, I've seen a lot of attacks on Max. He's young, he's smug, whatever. And I've seen lots of heavy lifting being done online to get the undergrad Max thing trending. Just wait until they find out the Prime Minister's backstory though. Yep, Albo is an undergrad, and yep, Albo has only had one non-political job in his whole life, the 12 months or so he spent as a bank officer when he was 18. And yep, Albo got into Parliament when he was in his early 30s as well, 33 to be exact. Regardless, I think all the commentary on his age is total horseshit. Ay caramba! I mean, you only have to observe the behaviour of some of our more senior politicians in question time to realise that for many, age really is just a number. I've also seen a few unsubstantiated allegations as to Max's motives. From what I can tell, they seem to have originated here and then have been copy-pasted into fairly generic meme format. Look, you don't have to like Max, you don't have to love Albo, you don't have to like the Greens or Labor. Forget about parties and personalities for a second. Fundamentally, do you think the HAFF is a good bill? Ask yourself, how can the centrepiece of a government's housing policy be considered good when it's so obviously unable to even keep pace with demand? It's a real shame that Albo didn't read the whole article in Parliament, but after reading it for myself, I think it's pretty clear why he didn't. Labor would do well to remember that one of the big reasons they're in government today is more about this guy than anything that they took to the election. At the end of the day, there's really only one simple question. Is the HAFF bill good? It's not, so let's encourage the government to make it better.